You may not hear the sounds of a sizzling steak as often this summer.
I am quite astounded at the prices, especially meat, in particular beef.
For 7 consecutive months, one of the United States' most reliable agricultural exports has quietly vanished from store shelves in Canada's cattle capital, triggering financial pain for American farmers and exposing how a trade war can begin not with tariffs, but with words. For decades, beef trade between the United States and Canada was considered untouchable. It survived recessions, disease outbreaks, and policy disputes. Alberta, a province built on ranching, routinely stocked American beef without controversy. That assumption no longer holds. What changed was not a new regulation or a formal tariff. It was a sharp escalation in political rhetoric, border tensions, and a growing perception among Canadians that their country was being treated with disregard. Reports of increased scrutiny at United States border crossings, combined with public remarks by Donald Trump referring to Canada as a potential 51st state, transformed a diplomatic dispute into a consumer backlash. Shoppers began reading labels. Retailers began adjusting inventories. And without announcements or bans, American beef began disappearing from Alberta supermarkets. What started as symbolic protest hardened into a sustained shift in demand. Today, American cattle producers are absorbing the consequences through falling prices, excess supply, and rising costs. But this story is not only about beef. What this analysis will ultimately reveal is far more serious than a consumer boycott. It points to an early-stage fracture in North American trade relations, one that is unfolding quietly, without formal tariffs, and may already be inflicting economic damage that policymakers in Washington have not yet recognized. Before the current trade war atmosphere took hold, Canada was the second-largest foreign destination for American beef. Annual exports routinely exceeded 1 million metric tons, with Alberta alone accounting for nearly 1/3 of that volume. In value terms, American beef sales to Canada averaged between 1.2 and 1.4 billion United States dollars per year, according to industry estimates compiled from cross-border trade filings and slaughter data tracked by the United States Department of Agriculture. Since American beef began disappearing from Alberta supermarket shelves 7 months ago, export volumes into Canada have fallen sharply. Preliminary shipping and customs data indicate a year-over-year decline of roughly 20% nationwide. In Alberta specifically, distributors report volume reductions closer to 30%, a collapse that has persisted quarter after quarter rather than rebounding. For American cattle producers, the impact is immediate and measurable. Cash cattle prices in northern plains states that traditionally supply the Canadian market have declined between 8 and 12% compared with the same period last year. Feedlots are holding animals longer than planned, driving up feed and veterinary costs, while cold storage utilization for unsold beef has risen by an estimated 18%. Transportation costs have also increased as exporters attempt to redirect product to more distant markets in Asia and the Middle East at lower margins. The pressure is most acute for small and mid-sized ranching operations. Unlike multinational processors, these producers do not hedge extensively or shift markets easily. Farm credit counselors report a noticeable rise in short-term loan extensions and delayed capital investments, particularly among family-owned operations that depend heavily on export price stability. In the next part, we examine why this data may represent not a temporary downturn, but the early statistical footprint of a deeper rupture that is yet to fully surface in official trade reports. What initially appeared to be a symbolic consumer backlash is now clearly visible in hard trade data, and the scale of the disruption is difficult to dismiss. 7 months after American beef began disappearing from Alberta supermarket shelves, that demand has not returned. Preliminary cross-border shipping data and distributor reports point to a nationwide year-over-year export decline of roughly 20%. In Alberta, where consumer resistance has been strongest, volume reductions are estimated at nearly 30% and have persisted across multiple quarters rather than rebounding. This is not a short-term dip caused by seasonal fluctuation. The absence has become structural. Retailers have adjusted procurement contracts, shelf allocations have been reassigned, and logistics routes, once dedicated to Canadian deliveries, now sit idle or are being repurposed at higher costs. The impact of this collapse is being felt most sharply at the farm gate. In northern plains states that traditionally supply beef to Canada, cash cattle prices have declined between 8 and 12% compared with the same period last year. Feedlots are holding animals longer than planned, increasing feed, veterinary, and labor expenses while compressing margins. Cold storage utilization for unsold beef has risen by an estimated 18%, adding further cost pressure. Transportation expenses have also increased as exporters attempt to redirect product toward more distant overseas markets, often at thinner margins and longer payment cycles. Small and mid-sized ranching operations are absorbing the greatest strain. Unlike large processors, these producers lack diversified export channels and financial buffers. Farm credit advisors report rising requests for short-term loan extensions, deferred equipment purchases, and postponed herd expansion decisions. For many family-owned operations, the loss of the Canadian market has turned what would have been a stable year into a balance sheet emergency. What is especially concerning is that Canada has already adjusted. Alberta retailers replaced American beef with domestic supply and alternative imports within weeks. Consumer prices stabilized, shelf space did not reopen. If one of the most integrated and historically loyal markets can recalibrate this quickly, the implications reach far beyond Alberta. In the next part, we examine why this adjustment may prove difficult to reverse and why the real economic damage may only begin appearing after policymakers believe the worst has passed. The damage from Alberta's boycott does not stop at cattle prices or export volumes. It is now spreading outward into rural economies across the United States in ways that are slower, quieter, and often missed in headline data. The American beef supply chain supports more than 700,000 direct and indirect jobs, spanning ranching, feed production, transportation, processing, equipment manufacturing, and rural services. When a major export market like Canada contracts sharply, the shock travels through each of these layers. In states that traditionally supply beef to Canada, including Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Nebraska, regional agricultural income reports show declining cash flow compared with the same period last year. Feed suppliers report delayed payments. Livestock transport firms report lower utilization rates on routes previously dedicated to cross-border shipments. Slaughter facilities face uneven throughput, forcing adjustments to shifts and temporary labor schedules. Local governments in rural counties are also beginning to feel secondary pressure. Lower farm income translates into weaker sales tax receipts, slower equipment purchases, and postponed land improvements. Rural banks report rising caution among borrowers, with more producers opting to preserve cash rather than invest in expansion or modernization. What makes this trend particularly concerning is timing. These effects are emerging during a period when many producers were already coping with higher input costs, including feed, fuel, and insurance. The loss of a stable export outlet compounds existing financial strain, leaving little margin for error. From a macro perspective, none of this yet appears dramatic enough to trigger alarms in national economic reports. But at the local level, the deterioration is visible, incremental, and cumulative. One of the most deceptive aspects of the current situation is that American consumers are not seeing meaningful price relief at grocery stores, despite excess supply in the beef sector. This creates the illusion that the system is absorbing the shock without consequence. In reality, surplus beef does not automatically translate into lower retail prices. Increased cold storage usage, longer holding periods in feedlots, and higher transportation costs all erode margins before any benefit reaches consumers. Processors and retailers prioritize stability over rapid price adjustments, especially in volatile trade environments shaped by trade war uncertainty and shifting tariffs expectations. Meanwhile, Canada's adjustment has been strikingly efficient. Alberta retailers replaced American beef with domestic supply and alternative imports within weeks. Pricing stabilized, consumer habits adapted. Importantly, shelf space once vacated by American products has not remained empty, nor has it reopened. This creates a structural challenge for United States producers. Once retailers restructure contracts and consumers adjust preferences, regaining market share becomes far more difficult than losing it. Trade relationships do not automatically revert when political tensions ease. Trust, once disrupted, requires time and incentives to rebuild. The most troubling element is that this recalibration is occurring without formal tariffs, without legislative action, and without clear warning signals in official trade policy. It is driven by consumer behavior and retailer risk management, not government decree. And that raises a deeply unsettling possibility. If market access can erode this quietly in one of the most integrated trading relationships in the world, similar dynamics could emerge elsewhere before policymakers realize what is happening. In the next part, we examine why this shift presents a strategic blind spot for Washington and how allies, competitors, and global markets are already drawing conclusions that have not yet reached the public debate. From the perspective of policymakers in Washington, the Alberta beef boycott barely registers as a crisis. There has been no formal tariff imposed, no legislative ban, and no official trade dispute filed through established channels. On paper, the trade relationship between the United States and Canada still appears intact. That perception is precisely the problem. Traditional trade analysis is designed to detect shocks caused by tariffs, quotas, or regulatory barriers. It is not built to measure politically driven consumer disengagement. As a result, the economic damage now unfolding remains largely invisible in headline trade statistics, even as it compounds month after month at the producer level. Official export data often lags real-world behavior by several quarters. By the time a sustained demand loss becomes undeniable in federal reports, supply chains may already have restructured permanently. Retail contracts will have been rewritten. Logistics routes will have been abandoned. Consumer preferences will have normalized around alternatives. In this case, Alberta did not need to impose tariffs to reduce American beef imports. Retailers adjusted inventory based on consumer sentiment and reputational risk. That shift required no announcement and triggered no diplomatic response. It simply happened. This creates a dangerous feedback loop for the United States because the disruption does not look like a trade war escalation on paper. It does not prompt corrective action. Yet at the ground level, producers are losing income, credit conditions are tightening, and rural economic stress is building. The result is a growing disconnect between policy perception and economic reality. Washington sees stability, farmers experience contraction. That gap matters because once policymakers recognize the scale of the problem, the tools available to reverse it may already be ineffective. While Washington underestimates the significance of the Alberta boycott, other countries are paying close attention. For allies, the episode demonstrates that the United States no longer enjoys automatic goodwill in trade relationships, even with its closest partners. Political rhetoric, once dismissed as symbolic, is now seen as economically consequential. Market access, once assumed to be secure, is being reevaluated through the lens of reliability and respect. For competitors, the lesson is even clearer. If consumer-driven trade disengagement can occur without tariffs or formal retaliation, then the United States faces vulnerabilities that traditional trade defenses cannot easily address. Market share can be lost quietly, incrementally, and without triggering diplomatic alarms. Canada's response also highlights a strategic advantage. As a mid-sized economy with diversified trade options, it can absorb supply shocks by shifting, sourcing, promoting domestic production, and leveraging consumer sentiment. The United States, by contrast, operates at a scale where lost markets are harder to replace and where surplus production creates internal stress rather than flexibility. This asymmetry carries long-term implications. Export-dependent sectors such as agriculture rely on trust, predictability, and stable relationships. When those erode, price competitiveness alone is often insufficient to restore access. The Alberta case suggests that future trade conflicts may not begin with tariffs at all. They may begin with perception, escalate through consumer behavior, and solidify through supply chain adaptation before governments respond. And that is what makes this moment particularly dangerous. The most severe consequences of this shift may not appear during the political confrontation that caused it. They may surface later, when markets have already moved on and when recovery becomes structurally difficult. In the next and final part, we will examine why this trend could extend far beyond beef and why the long-term cost to the United States may only become visible after policymakers believe the crisis has passed. 7 months without American beef on Alberta supermarket shelves has already delivered a clear verdict. This is no longer a symbolic boycott, and it is no longer temporary. The economic damage to United States farmers is real, measurable, and ongoing. Prices have weakened, costs have risen, market access once taken for granted has quietly narrowed. But the deeper risk lies ahead. What makes this episode especially troubling is not the scale of the losses so far, but the mechanism behind them. No tariffs were imposed, no trade agreements were suspended, no official retaliation was announced. Instead, trust eroded, consumers adjusted, and supply chains adapted silently and efficiently. That pattern is difficult to reverse. Once retailers rewrite contracts and consumers normalize alternatives, political de-escalation alone does not restore demand. Markets remember behavior long after headlines fade. For the United States, this creates a strategic challenge that traditional trade tools are poorly equipped to address. If politically driven consumer disengagement spreads beyond beef into other agricultural sectors, the cumulative impact could reshape North American trade flows in ways that do not appear in policy briefings until it is too late. The question now is not whether American farmers have been affected. That answer is already clear. The real question is this: is Washington prepared for a trade war where the most damaging blows arrive quietly, without tariffs, and long after leaders believe the crisis is past? Subscribe for more fact-based global analysis where economic signals matter more than political noise.